there's a monster lurking in the world's sweetest love song. In 1981, America was immersed in the romantic piano melody of Keep On Loving You. But if you listen closely, you'll hear a bleeding scar cutting through the song. That's Gary Richrath's guitar. It's not music. It's the growl of a wounded animal, a ferocious, thick, angry sound that sounds like it wants to tear apart the slick pretense of the pop industry. Gary was the soul of REO Speedwagon. He was the man who took the band from the smoky bars of Illinois to the top with his bare hands and a Les Paul. But ironically, when the band reached the top, they chose safety. Gary chose danger. This is the autopsy of a brotherhood killed by fame. The story of the man who built the machine, only to be crushed by the machine and cast aside by history. Gary Dean Richrath was born on October 18, 1949, in Peoria, Illinois. To our friends listening from across the pond or elsewhere in the world, the name Peoria might not conjure an immediate image. It is not the sun-drenched glamour of Los Angeles. It is not the artistic, gritty bustle of New York City. In the middle of the 20th century, Peoria was the quintessential American every town, but with a harder edge. Built on the back of industry and home to Caterpillar Inc., Peoria was a working-class stronghold where the air tasted of metal and diesel. It was a working-class stronghold where the path of a young man's life was usually carved in stone before he was even born. You went to school, you graduated, you got a job at the plant, you raised a family, and you retired. It was a life of stability, of practicality, and of profound predictability. Gary's parents, Curtis and Eunice Richrath, were the embodiment of this solid Midwestern ethos. They raised Gary and his brother in East Peoria, a community separated from the main city by the Illinois River. It was a childhood of harsh winters, where the wind would whip off the river and cut through the thickest coats. It was a place where dreams were considered suspicious if they didn't involve a pension plan. But from a very young age, Gary Richrath did not fit the mold of the future factory worker. He was a quiet boy, often introverted, but there was a kinetic energy humming beneath the surface. He was searching for a voice. And in a twist of fate that would come to define his entire musical identity, the instrument he first chose to find that voice was not the guitar. It was the saxophone. This is the crucial key to unlocking the mystery of Gary Richrath's genius. Most guitar heroes of the 1970s and 80s started their journey idolizing bluesmen or early rockers. They learned by mimicking the finger movements of Chuck Berry or the slide work of Muddy Waters. They approached music as a percussive rhythmic exercise. Gary Richrath spent his formative years in the school band at East Peoria Community High School with a reed in his mouth and brass in his hands. He was learning a completely different language. When you play a saxophone, you learn that the instrument is an extension of your own body. It is dependent on your lungs. You learn about breath. You learn that a note isn't just a frequency. It is a living thing that needs to be sustained. You learn about phrasing, the art of speaking through the instrument. A saxophonist knows when to scream, when to whisper, and most importantly, when to pause to take a breath. For years, Gary disciplined his mind with the logic of wind instruments. He learned melody not as a sequence of dots on a fretboard, but as a vocal line. He learned that a single note, held long enough and with enough emotion, could say more than 1,000 fast ones. But as Gary entered his teenage years in the mid-1960s, the world outside East Peoria was catching fire. The British invasion had landed. The Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. The Rolling Stones were terrifying parents across the nation. The radio was no longer playing the big band jazz or the polite pop of the 50s. It was playing the sound of revolution. The saxophone, for all its beauty, began to feel like an artifact of the past to a teenage boy in 1965. It was the instrument of his parents' generation. Gary wanted the instrument of the future. He wanted the noise. He wanted the electricity. So, he put down the saxophone and picked up a guitar. Gary Richrath never took a guitar lesson in his life. This is a statement that is often thrown around in rock biographies as a badge of honor, a sign of natural talent. But in Gary's case, it explains everything about his unique, almost bizarre style. Because no one told him how he was supposed to play. He simply applied what he knew. And what he knew was the saxophone. He approached the fretboard of the guitar as if it were the keys of a horn. He didn't strum chords like a folk singer. He attacked individual notes. He wanted the guitar to sing, to sustain, to breathe. This self-taught approach birthed his most famous trademark, his vibrato. For the uninitiated, vibrato is the technique of oscillating a finger on the string to make the pitch waver, giving the note warmth and character. Most guitarists use a gentle wrist-based motion. B.B. King had his famous butterfly flutter. Eric Clapton had his smooth, slow pulse. Gary Richrath's vibrato was violent. He didn't just wiggle the string, he shook it. He would grab a note and bend it wide, shaking it with a frantic, aggressive energy that sounded like a desperate plea. It was a wide vibrato, one that covered a lot of sonic distance. Music critics in Chicago would later struggle to describe it. One writer for the Chicago Sun-Times called it jealous. Another called it gossip. It sounded like a human voice screaming in an argument. It was emotional, it was imperfect, and it was utterly, undeniably human. He found his partner in crime in a specific piece of equipment, the 1959 Gibson Les Paul Standard. In the world of guitars, the 59 Les Paul is the Holy Grail. It is the Excalibur. It is a heavy, solid block of mahogany and maple that produces a thick, creamy, thunderous tone. Gary didn't treat this expensive instrument with kid gloves. He treated it as a weapon of war. And he had a philosophy that was almost monk-like in its simplicity. He hated effects pedals. He didn't want fuzz boxes, delay units, or wah-wah pedals coloring his sound. He believed in the purity of the signal chain. The guitar, a cable, and a wall of Marshall amplifiers turned up to ear-shattering volumes. He wanted the sound of the wood and the tubes. He wanted the truth. By the time he graduated from East Peoria Community High School in 1967, Gary was already a local legend. While his classmates were applying for jobs at the tractor plant or worrying about the draft for Vietnam, Gary was locking himself in his room, playing until his fingers bled, trying to make 6 strings sound like a symphony of horns. The gray skies of Peoria were still hanging over him, but Gary was creating his own weather. Upon graduation, Gary didn't flee to the coast. He didn't run to New York or L.A. He stayed in the Midwest, but he refused the destiny the city offered him. In 1968, he joined a band with a name that was dripping with unintentional irony, Suburban 9 to 5. The name represented everything Gary was trying to escape. The 9 to 5 grind, the suburban apathy. But the band itself was his boot camp. They played the Chitlin circuit of the Midwest. These weren't glamorous gigs. They were playing in VFW halls, high school gymnasiums, and sticky-floored bars where the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke was thick enough to chew on. It was in these rough venues that Gary learned the art of showmanship. He learned that in a noisy bar, you couldn't just stand there and look at your shoes. You had to command attention. You had to be larger than life. He developed a stage presence that was magnetic. He was a handsome young man with a mop of hair and a rugged, approachable charm. But when he plugged in that Les Paul, He transformed. He would stand with his legs splayed wide in a power stance, the guitar slung low over his hips, his head thrown back as he wrestled a solo out of the instrument. He wasn't just playing music, he was performing an exorcism. He was the coolest guy in the room and everyone knew it. But Peoria, for all its support, was a small pond. Gary was a shark. He needed an ocean. Just a few hours away, in the college town of Champaign, Illinois, another band was struggling to find its identity. They were a group of University of Illinois students who had named themselves after a high-speed fire truck from 1915, REO Speedwagon. At that time, REO Speedwagon was not a rock titan. They were a bar band. They played boogie-woogie covers. They were popular on campus, playing frat parties and beer halls. But they lacked an edge. They were polite. They were safe. They were missing the fire. They had a keyboard player named Neil Dowdy, a drummer named Alan Greatzer, and a rotating cast of other members. But they were looking for something specific. They were looking for a guitar player who could take their sound from the frat house to the arena. In 1970, their paths collided. The story of how Gary joined REO Speedwagon is the stuff of local legend. The band's current guitarist was flaky, unreliable. They needed fresh blood. They heard whispers about this kid from Peoria, this wild man with the Les Paul who played like he was trying to tear the roof off the building. Gary Richrath showed up for the audition, or perhaps it was just a jam session that turned into an audition. He didn't bring a resume. He brought his amp. When he plugged in and hit the first chord, the air in the room changed. It wasn't just loud, it was heavy. It was the sound of a jet engine taking off. The polite boogie-woogie college band suddenly sounded dangerous. Neil Dowdy, the keyboardist and founding member, would later recall that moment. He realized instantly that this wasn't just a new member. This was a new direction. Gary didn't just join the band, he hijacked it. He brought with him the grit of the Peoria factory floor, the soul of the saxophone, and the swagger of a rock star who hadn't made it yet. Gary Dean Richrath had found his vehicle, and REO Speedwagon had found its engine. The year was 1970. The 60s were dead. The era of peace and love was over. The era of hard rock was beginning. And Gary Richrath, the kid from the city of chimneys, was about to take this college band on a ride that would lead them to the highest peaks of fame and the deepest valleys of despair. But before the platinum records and the private jets, they had to survive the road. And the road, as they were about to find out, was a cruel mistress. By 1971, REO Speedwagon was no longer just a band. It was a blue-collar machine fueled by cheap gasoline, lukewarm beer, and a desperate, burning ambition. The comfortable, ivy-covered walls of the University of Illinois in Champaign were fading in the rearview mirror, replaced by the endless flat gray horizon of the American interstate system. To understand Gary Richrath's life in the early 1970s, you have to understand the geography of rock and roll in that era. There were the coasts, New York and Los Angeles, where the critics lived, where the record labels built their glass towers, and where the cool trends were decided. And then there was everything in between, the flyover states, the Rust Belt, the Corn Belt. This was Gary's kingdom. While the critics in Rolling Stone magazine were obsessing over the art rock of David Bowie or the California slickness of the Eagles, Gary Richrath was driving a beat-up station wagon through a blizzard in Nebraska to play for 300 farmers and factory workers in a high school gymnasium. This wasn't a glamorous life, it was a war of attrition. The band's first album, simply titled REO Speedwagon, released in 1971, was a commercial dud. It barely scratched the charts. It was a raw boogie rock record that sounded like a band trying to find its footing on a slippery floor. But on stage, something else was happening. Gary Richrath was becoming a monster. In those early days before they had roadies to tune their guitars or adjust their amps, Gary was the captain of the ship. He was the one shouting instructions to the sound guy. He was the one glaring at the drummer, Alan Gratzer, to push the tempo faster. He was the one who realized that in a cavernous, echoing hall with bad acoustics, subtlety was death. You had to be loud. You had to cut through the air like a knife. He began to perfect his tone. He realized that his 1959 Les Paul had a sweet spot. If he turned his Marshall amp all the way up, pushed the tubes until they were glowing hot and ready to melt, and then rolled the volume knob on his guitar back just a hair, he could get a sound that was clean but sustained. But if he rolled that volume knob to 10, the amp would explode into a glorious controlled feedback. Gary learned to play the amp as much as he played the guitar. But a great guitarist needs a foil. A Led Zeppelin needs a Robert Plant to its Jimmy Page. An Aerosmith needs a Steven Tyler to its Joe Perry. REO Speedwagon had a revolving door of singers. Terry Luttrell, the vocalist on the first album, didn't last. He couldn't handle the friction. In 1972, the band found a skinny, curly-haired folk singer from Chicago named Kevin Cronin. The first meeting between Gary Richrath and Kevin Cronin should have been a disaster. They were from different planets. Gary was the street-smart tough guy from Peoria, the sax player turned guitar god who drank hard, lived hard, and wanted to rock hard. Kevin was the introspective songwriter, a guy who idolized Elton John and bread and butter pop. Gary was leather jackets and whiskey. Kevin was acoustic guitars and herbal tea. It was oil and water. But when you shake oil and water violently enough, they create an emulsion. When Kevin joined for the album REO/TWO in 1972, the friction was immediate. Gary wanted the songs to be heavier. He wanted riff-based rockers. Kevin brought in ballads. He brought in songs with complex chord structures and sensitive lyrics about relationships. Most bands would have broken up, but Gary, with his intuitive musical genius, realized something. Kevin's voice, that high, reedy, slightly nasal tenor, had a cutting quality that matched Gary's guitar, and Kevin's melodic softness provided the perfect bed for Gary's hard rock aggression. They began a songwriting partnership that was defined by combat. They would argue over every chord change. They would fight over the volume of the guitars in the mix. Gary would accuse Kevin of trying to turn them into a folk band. Kevin would accuse Gary of trying to drown out the lyrics with noise. But the music that came out of this conflict was undeniable. However, the initial experiment failed. The tension was too high. During the recording of their third album, the arguments became so toxic that Kevin Cronin left the band. He quit or was fired, depending on who you ask. The grand experiment of the two-headed monster seemed to be over before it truly began. 1973 to 1975 were the dark ages for REO Speedwagon fans, but for Gary Richrath, they were the years that proved his mettle. With Kevin gone, the band hired a new singer, Mike Murphy. Murphy was a capable vocalist, but he lacked Cronin's distinct personality. The band drifted. They were searching for an identity. But it was during this chaotic, uncertain time that Gary Richrath wrote the song that would define his legacy. The story of Ridin' the Storm Out is one of the great creation myths of rock history. And unlike many myths, this one is almost entirely true. It was the winter of 1973. The band was on tour in Colorado. They were scheduled to play a gig in Boulder. They were traveling in their battered vehicles, navigating the treacherous mountain roads of the Rockies. Suddenly, the sky turned black. A Yankee Clipper, a massive freezing storm front, slammed into the mountains. The temperature plummeted. The snow came down in blinding sheets. The band managed to make it to a place called the Tulagi, a music venue and bar in Boulder. But they were trapped. The roads were closed. The power lines were icing over. Outside, the wind was howling with a ferocity that sounded like the end of the world. Gary Richrath didn't huddle. He was pacing. The energy of the storm was infecting him. He felt the danger, the adrenaline of being at the mercy of nature. He picked up his guitar. He didn't plug it in. The power might have been flickering, but he could hear the sound in his head. He started playing a riff. It wasn't a blues riff. It wasn't a boogie riff. It was a siren, a piercing, repetitive wail, a relentless, driving pulse that mimicked the urgency of the civil defense sirens he had heard growing up in Peoria during tornado drills. It mimicked the howling of the wind outside the bar. He started writing lyrics on a cocktail napkin. He wasn't trying to be poetic. He was just documenting the moment. Riding the storm out, waiting for the thaw out on a full moon night in the Rocky Mountain winter. When the storm finally broke and the band made it to the studio, they captured that freezing energy. Keyboardist Neil Doughty used a synthesizer to create that specific swirling wind sound for the intro, a siren screaming through the blizzard, and then Gary's guitar kicks in. That central riff is the heartbeat of Gary Richrath. It is propulsive, anxious, and unstoppable. The song didn't become a massive #1 hit immediately, but on the road it became a monster. It became the show closer. It became the moment when the audience would lose their minds. It was the anthem of survival. It was Gary saying to the world, "We are stuck in a blizzard, we are broke, we have no singer, but we are not dying tonight." By 1976, the band was at a crossroads. Mike Murphy left. They were a band with a killer guitarist, a tight rhythm section, and no voice. The record label was getting impatient. They needed a frontman who could match Gary's fire. Gary Richrath did something that required immense humility. He picked up the phone and called Kevin Cronin. The reunion was cautious. The old wounds were still there, but both men had realized something in their time apart. They were better together. Gary needed Kevin's melodies to make his heavy riffs palatable to radio. Kevin needed Gary's edge to keep his ballads from becoming elevator music. Kevin returned and the band entered their golden era. The first order of business was to prove to the world what they already knew. REO Speedwagon was one of the greatest live bands in America. In 1977, REO released Live, You Get What You Play For. This album is essential listening for anyone who wants to understand Gary Richrath. On the studio albums, his solos were often trimmed for time. On You Get What You Play For, the leash was taken off. Listen to the live version of Golden Country. This was a political song Gary wrote, a scathing critique of the corruption and decay he saw in America's heartland. The lyrics are biting, but the solo is a weeping, screaming masterpiece. It stretches out, building from a slow, mournful blues into a frantic, high-speed assault. Or listen to the live version of Riding the Storm Out. When Gary hits that opening riff, the crowd noise is deafening. You can hear the sheer volume of his Marshall stack. It is raw, unpolished, and incredibly powerful. This album captured the Richrath sound in its purest form, a Gibson Les Paul filling a hockey arena with pure electricity. The live album went platinum. It proved that the Midwest boys were contenders. 1978 changed everything. The band went into the studio to record their 7th album. They chose a title that was a nonsensical dad joke. You can tune a piano, but you can't tune a fish. It was silly, but the music inside was deadly serious. For the first time, Gary Richrath and Kevin Cronin took full control of the production. They were tired of producers trying to tame them. They wanted the record to sound like them. This album marked a subtle but profound shift in Gary's playing. He began to focus more on texture and melody. He wasn't just soloing over the top. He was weaving his guitar parts into the fabric of the songs. Take the track, roll with the changes. It's a Kevin Cronin song, a driving piano-led anthem about moving forward. But listen to what Gary does. He doesn't just play power chords. He plays these stabbing rhythmic fills that propel the song forward. And his solo is joyous. It soars, climbing higher and higher until it matches the optimism of the lyrics. And then there was Time for Me to Fly. This was the template for the future. Acoustic verses, heavy choruses. It was the power ballad in its embryonic form. Gary's heavy guitars in the chorus gave the song a weight that a pure pop song would have lacked. The album was a massive success. It sold 2 million copies. It put them on FM radio rotation across the country. REO Speedwagon was no longer an opening act, they were headliners. But as the 70s drew to a close, a new anxiety began to creep in. The music world was changing again. Punk had exploded and faded. Disco had taken over and was now being burned in stadiums. New wave was rising. Synthesizers were replacing guitars. By 1979, the pressure on REO Speedwagon was immense. The record label wanted a #1, they wanted a blockbuster. The band retreated to the studio to write their next album, 9 Lives. When they released it in 1979, the reaction was mixed. However, the album did contain Gary's defining anthem, Only the Strong Survive. This song was his manifesto, a direct reflection of the Darwinian struggle of the music business. Musically, it was a beast, featuring a Motown-inspired backing vocal section, a funky, driving verse, and a chorus that hit like a sledgehammer. And the guitar work was impeccable, tight, disciplined, yet full of that signature, aggressive shake. But aside from this track, the album felt like a lateral move. The label panicked. The critics sharpened their knives. Was REO Speedwagon just another 70s relic? Inside the band, the tension between Gary and Kevin reached a boiling point. They went into the recording sessions for High Infidelity in 1980 with a sense of desperation. One particular argument would define the future of the band. Kevin had written a song on the piano. It was a simple, repetitive loop of chords, G, C, D. The lyrics were about discovering that his wife had been unfaithful. It was raw, emotional, and very soft. He brought it to the rehearsal room. He started playing it on the piano. You played dead, but you never bled. Gary listened. He hated it. To him, it sounded like a lounge song. It sounded like Barry Manilow. It wasn't rock and roll. He walked over to his Marshall stack. He plugged in his '59 Les Paul. He turned everything to 10 and started playing along, but instead of gentle arpeggios, he slammed out massive, distorted power chords, unleashing a wall of sound designed to sabotage the song. He was trying to prove a point. This song is too soft, and I'm going to bury it in noise. But a strange thing happened. When Kevin heard the massive wall of distortion against his pretty piano melody, his eyes lit up. It wasn't noise, it was power. The distortion gave the anger in the lyrics a physical weight. The sweetness of the piano represented the love that was lost. The violence of the guitar represented the betrayal. That song was Keep On Loving You. But there was another song on the album that would become Gary's battleground. Take It On the Run. Gary wrote this one, and in his head he heard it as a Tom Petty-style rocker, driving, jangly, fast. But as the band worked on it, it slowed down. It became more spacious. Kevin's vocals became more prominent. When it came time for the solo, Gary walked into the tracking room. He was angry. He felt the song was getting too pop. He wanted to reclaim it. He did the solo in one take. Listen to the start of the solo in Take It on the Run. It begins with a series of slow, deliberate bends. It sounds like someone taking a deep breath before screaming. And then he unleashes a flurry of notes that are so precise, so melodic, yet so aggressive that it leaves you breathless. He plays through the changes, weaving in and out of the chords with a jazz player's ear and a punk rocker's attitude. It is widely considered one of the greatest constructed solos in rock history. High Infidelity was released in November 1980. The reaction was not immediate. It was a slow burn, but then radio stations started playing Keep On Loving You, then Take It on the Run. It was an avalanche. The album went to number 1, and it dominated the charts for 15 weeks. It was the soundtrack of 1981. You could not turn on a radio, walk into a mall, or sit in a dentist's waiting room without hearing Kevin Cronin's voice and Gary Richrath's guitar. But in the shadow of this blinding success, the cracks that had been patched over with platinum records began to widen. For Kevin Cronin, High Infidelity was validation. It proved that his melodic, ballad-heavy approach was the way forward. He felt vindicated. The soft songs were the ones selling the millions. For Gary Richrath, High Infidelity was a confusing victory. Yes, he was a superstar with an overflowing bank account, but he looked at the set list and realized the heavy, bluesy jams of the early 70s were being erased. Gary was standing on top of the mountain, but he realized with a sinking feeling that the mountain was no longer made of rock. It was made of sugar. The year 1981 dawned not with a sunrise, but with the blinding flash of paparazzi cameras and the roar of sold-out arenas. For REO Speedwagon, the climb was over. They had reached the summit. But there is an old adage in the music business, one that Gary Richrath was about to learn the hard way. Getting to the top is the easy part. Staying there is the torture. For Gary, the High Infidelity tour was a blur of excess and adoration. He was now a bona fide guitar hero. He was on the cover of magazines. He bought the big house in Encino, California. But from his vantage point on stage right, Gary noticed a shift. The band was no longer a gang of underdogs fighting for respect. They were a corporation. And corporations require maintenance. They require safety. They require predictability. Gary Richrath was many things, a brilliant musician, a charismatic performer, a loyal friend. But predictable was not a word anyone used to describe him. He was a creature of instinct. He thrived on the chaotic energy of the moment. And as REO Speedwagon transformed into a well-oiled hit-making machine, the machine began to chafe against the man. The pressure to follow up High Infidelity was crushing. In 1982, exhausted and running on fumes, the band retreated to the studio to record Good Trouble. History has not been kind to Good Trouble. Even Kevin Cronin would later admit that it was a mistake, a rushed, forced effort made by a band that was burned out. They tried to replicate the magic of the previous album by returning to the same studio and using the same producer. They hoped that lightning would strike the same tree twice. For Gary, this album was a desperate battleground. He could feel the band slipping further into the realm of soft rock, and he fought to keep the fire alive, quite literally. He fought to keep the fire alive with tracks like The Key. If you listen to this song today, you hear Gary refusing to go quietly. It's a straight-ahead rocker, a desperate attempt to inject some adrenaline into a production that was becoming increasingly sterile. But it was buried amidst the radio-friendly ballads. But the rest of the album felt flat. It lacked the grit of the 70s and the sparkle of High Infidelity. It was the sound of a band fulfilling a contract. Despite the creative fatigue, the album sold well, but the critics tore Good Trouble apart. They called it corporate rock. They called it soulless. These words hurt Gary. He prided himself on soul. He prided himself on authenticity. To be labeled a corporate shill was a dagger to the heart. As the calendar flipped to 1983 and 1984, the ground beneath rock and roll shifted tectonically. The 1980s were entering their high-tech phase. The warm, tube-driven sounds of the 70s were being replaced by the cold, precise sounds of the digital age. Synthesizers like the Yamaha DX7 were replacing Hammond organs. Drum machines were replacing drummers. The production style became glossy, reverb-drenched, and processed. Gary Richrath was an analog man. He was a flesh-and-blood wood and wire musician. He didn't use rack-mounted effects processors. He didn't use MIDI controllers. He used a Les Paul and a Marshall. This refusal to adapt wasn't just stubbornness, it was an artistic stance. Gary believed that the tone was in the hands, not the microchip. But in the recording studios of the mid-80s, engineers were looking for perfection. They wanted to grid the drums. They wanted to compress the guitars until they fit neatly into a specific frequency range. Gary's distinctive wide bends, that wild, imperfect human wail, were suddenly seen as messy. His feedback-drenched sustains were seen as noise. He found himself fighting not just Kevin Cronin, but the entire zeitgeist of the decade. In 1984, after a much-needed hiatus, the band regrouped to record Wheels Are Turning. They knew they had to bounce back. They needed a hit. And Kevin Cronin had one in his back pocket. The song was Can't Fight This Feeling. When Kevin brought the song to the band, the reaction was mixed. It was beautiful, undeniably, but it was soft. It was softer than Keep On Loving You. It was practically a lullaby. Gary Richrath looked at the chord chart. There was almost no room for him. The song was dominated by piano and synthesizers. The drums were big and pillowy. The bass was simple. Where was the guitar? In the final mix of Can't Fight This Feeling, Gary's presence is almost ghostly. There are some subtle acoustic strums. There is a very brief, very restrained solo that mimics the melody, but the fire, the storm, they were gone. The song was released in 1985. It went to #1. It stayed there for 3 weeks. It became the definitive power ballad of the 1980s. It saved the band's career, it made them relevant again, but it also sealed Gary's fate. REO Speedwagon was now, unequivocally, the band that sings Can't Fight This Feeling. They were a pop act. The hard rock identity of the 1970s was officially dead and buried. For Gary, the success of the song was a bitter pill. He was standing on stage every night playing this song to thousands of lighter-waving fans, knowing that his contribution was negligible. He was a prop. As the music became softer, Gary's life became harder. The 1980s were a decade of excess, and REO Speedwagon was not immune. But while some members of the band began to clean up their acts, settling down into family lives and treating the band like a business, Gary remained the wild card. He was the last of the Mohicans. He lived the rock and roll lifestyle 24 hours a day. This created a social rift within the band. The tour bus became divided. The dressing rooms became separate territories. On one side, you had the business faction, Kevin and the others. On the other side, you had Gary, increasingly isolated. Alcohol became a constant companion. It was a way to numb the boredom of playing the same ballads every night. It was a way to deal with the frustration of having his songs rejected from the albums. By 1987, the wheels were coming off the wagon. The band went into the studio to record Life as We Know It. The title was prophetic. Life as they knew it was about to end. The recording sessions were a nightmare of tension. Kevin Cronin had assumed almost total control of the band's direction. Gary was now an employee in the company he had helped build. Gary's contributions to this album were minimal. His songwriting output had dried up. He was struggling to find his place in the heavily synthesized sound the band was pursuing. The song, That Ain't Love, stands out as a final gasp of the old dynamic. It has a bit of a bite, but the production is so polished, so 1987, that the grit is almost completely sanded off. When the album was released, it performed moderately well, but the decline was obvious. The pop charts were moving on. Guns N' Roses released Appetite for Destruction in 1987. Real, dirty, dangerous rock and roll was coming back, but it wasn't coming from REO Speedwagon. It was coming from the Sunset Strip. The irony is tragic. Gary Richrath was exactly the kind of guitarist who could have thrived in the Guns N' Roses era. He had the tone, he had the attitude, he had the Les Paul, but he was trapped in a band that was trying to be Air Supply. He was a man out of time. The tour for Life as We Know It was a slog. The joy was gone. The onstage chemistry that had once been electric was now forced. Gary and Kevin, the two-headed monster, would barely look at each other. Gary was unhappy. He was vocal about it. He hated the drum machines. He hated the sequencing. He hated that his guitar was being pushed lower and lower in the mix. He wanted to rock. He wanted to feel the danger again. The end did not come with a bang. There was no dramatic onstage meltdown like The Who or Oasis. There was no trashing of a hotel room. It came in a boardroom, or perhaps over a phone call. The details have always been kept purposefully vague, hidden behind the sanitized language of press releases. In 1989, it was announced that Gary Richrath was leaving REO Speedwagon. The official reason was the classic creative differences. And for once, it was the absolute truth. Gary wanted to go left. The band wanted to go right. The tether that had held them together for nearly 20 years had finally snapped. But beneath the creative differences lay a deeper, sadder truth. The brotherhood was broken. The friendship that had birthed Ridin' the Storm Out had been eroded by years of compromise, resentment, and the distorting lens of fame. For Gary, the immediate aftermath wasn't just a party, it was a vacuum. After nearly 2 decades of schedules, tour buses, and adoring crowds, the silence was deafening. He looked in the mirror and faced a terrifying reality. The band had moved on with brutal efficiency. They hired a new guitarist, Dave Amato, a professional who could play the notes perfectly. But for Gary, watching a stranger play his solo on Ridin' the Storm Out felt like watching someone live in his house, sleeping in his bed, and eating his dinner. It was a surreal, out-of-body experience. The songs he had birthed in snowstorms and cheap motels were now just content for the band to perform. Gary had 2 choices. He could retire or he could fight. Gary Richrath was a fighter. He was the kid who learned to play guitar by listening to saxophones. He was the guy who stared down blizzards in the Rockies. He wasn't going to go quietly into the night. He decided to build a new wagon. But Gary was about to launch a comeback in the most hostile environment imaginable for a classic rock guitarist. The year was 1990. The tectonic plates of music were shifting violently. In the clubs of Seattle, a new sound was brewing. It was ugly, it was sludgy, it was angry. It was called grunge. Bands like Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, and a trio called Nirvana were rewriting the rules. The 1980s had been about excess, big hair, spandex, fast solos. Grunge was the anti-Richrath. Grunge guitarists didn't play solos, they played anti-solos. They didn't care about tone in the traditional sense, they wanted noise. In the eyes of the new generation, Generation X, guys like Gary Richrath were dinosaurs. They were the corporate rock establishment that needed to be overthrown. The timing for a Gary Richrath solo project could not have been worse. It was like trying to sell a gas-guzzling muscle car in the middle of an oil crisis. But Gary didn't care about trends. He never had. He believed in the power of the song. He believed that if he just got a band together and played his music, the hard rock, the blues-infused power that REO had abandoned, the fans would come back. He began to assemble his army. He found a man named Michael Johns. Michael Johns was a talented musician from the Midwest, but the thing that struck everyone immediately was his voice. He sounded eerily like Kevin Cronin. He possessed a vocal timbre that echoed that distinct, cutting high tenor range Gary's guitar had always complemented perfectly. It was a sonic ghostly twin. Why did Gary choose a singer who sounded like the man he had just divorced professionally? Psychologists might call it an inability to let go. Critics called it an attempt to clone REO Speedwagon. But from a musical standpoint, it made perfect sense. Gary had spent 20 years crafting his guitar style around Kevin's voice. His guitar frequencies were perfectly EQ'd to sit underneath that specific vocal range. Hiring Michael Johns wasn't an act of mimicry, it was an act of comfort. He named the band Richrath. No clever monikers, just his name. It was a stamp of ownership. It was him saying, "This is the real thing." The band Richrath spent the early 90s writing and recording. They secured a deal with a smaller label, GNP Crescendo. In 1992, they released their debut album titled Only the Strong Survive. The title was a direct callback to the song Gary had written for REO back in 1979. It was a declaration of resilience. If you listen to this album today, removed from the context of 1992, it is a solid, surprisingly strong, hard rock record. It sounds exactly what REO Speedwagon should have sounded like if they hadn't gone pop. The opening track, Outlaw, is a statement of intent. It starts with a heavy chugging riff. Gary's guitar sounds huge, much bigger and more aggressive than it had on the last few REO albums. The lyrics are defiant. I'm an outlaw. I play by my own rules. But the centerpiece of the album is Gary's playing. He sounds unleashed. Freed from the constraints of Kevin Cronin's pop production, he lets the Les Paul breathe. The feedback is back. The jealous vibrato is wider than ever. He plays with the hunger of a 20-year-old trying to prove himself, not a 40-year-old veteran. It was a noble effort. It was a good album. But it was released in 1992. In 1992, the #1 album in America was Nevermind by Nirvana. The radio stations that used to play REO Speedwagon were now playing Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. The album Only the Strong Survive didn't chart. It didn't sell millions. It vanished into the ether. The tour that followed was a humbling reality check. For the better part of a decade, Gary Richrath had toured in private jets and luxury buses. He had played in arenas like Madison Square Garden. Now he was in a van. The band Richrath hit the road, playing clubs, state fairs, and biker bars. The venues held 500 people, maybe 1,000 on a good night. Sometimes they played to 50 people. For a lesser man, this would have been humiliating, but accounts from this era suggest that Gary actually enjoyed it. There was a purity to it. In a small club, there are no hiding places, there are no jumbo screens. There is just the band and the audience. The sweat is real. The connection is immediate. Gary was back in his element. He was back to being the bar band warrior from Peoria. He would stand on the edge of the small stages, leaning over the crowd, letting them touch Old Glory, his nickname for the Les Paul. He would sign autographs for hours after the show. He would drink with the fans. These were the diehards. These were the people who, like Gary, felt abandoned by REO's turn to pop. They came to see the guitar player. They came to hear the noise. There is a poignancy to this period. Imagine seeing a legend, a man who defined the sound of a generation, playing on a sticky stage in a bowling alley bar in Wisconsin. It's tragic in one sense, but heroic in another. He was doing it for the love of the game. He wasn't phoning it in. He played riding the storm out with the same intensity for 100 people as he did for 100,000. But the economics of a club tour are brutal. Without the support of a major label, the money ran out. The grind of the road, hauling gear, driving through the night, sleeping in cheap motels, takes a toll on a body that is no longer 25, and the demons were still there. We must address the elephant in the room. The rock and roll lifestyle that Gary embraced in the 70s didn't stop just because the arenas turned into clubs. Alcohol was a constant. It was the fuel that kept the engine running, but it was also the rust that was eating away at the gears. In the intimate setting of the club tour, the fans could see it up close. Sometimes Gary was on fire, playing with brilliance and precision. Other nights he was slower. His movements were heavy. The spark in his eyes was dimmed by a haze of intoxication. He was self-medicating. He was medicating the pain of the breakup with REO. He was medicating the frustration of his solo career failing to launch. The Richrath band managed to stay afloat for a few years, but by the mid-90s the momentum stalled. The band members, needing to make a living, drifted away. Michael Johns remained loyal, a true friend to the end, but even he couldn't keep the ship afloat with just one sail. The project quietly dissolved. There was no farewell tour, no press release. The van just stopped rolling. Around 1996 or 1997, Gary Richrath returned to California. He parked the car, he put the Les Paul in its case, and he closed the door. This marked the beginning of the silence. It is rare for a public figure to vanish so completely in the modern age. Usually they pop up on Where Are They Now shows. They do the nostalgia circuit. Gary did none of that. He severed ties with the industry. He stopped doing interviews. He became a rumor. In the pre-social media age of the late 90s, information traveled slowly. Fans would post on early internet message boards, "Has anyone seen Gary? Is he sick? Is he dead?" The rumors were wild. Some said he was destitute. Some said he had lost his mind. The truth was far more mundane and far more sad. He was just tired. He was a man who had given everything to the god of rock and roll, and the god had chewed him up and spit him out. He was physically exhausted from 30 years of touring. He was emotionally drained from the breakup of his band. He lived off his royalties. REO Speedwagon was still played on the radio every day. The checks kept coming in, ensuring he wouldn't starve. But the music stopped. Imagine the silence in that house. A man who had lived his life at 110 decibels now living in quiet. Did he play guitar in his living room? Did he write songs that no one would ever hear? Or did he look at the guitar case in the corner with resentment, seeing it as the instrument of his rise and his fall? While Gary sat in silence, the entity known as REO Speedwagon continued to chug along. They became a nostalgia act, a heritage band. Kevin Cronin continued to front the band, smiling, singing the hits. Dave Amato played Gary's solos note for note. To the casual fan, it didn't matter. But to the hardcore fans, there was a hole on stage right, a phantom limb. The soul was missing. Occasionally, Kevin Cronin would mention Gary in interviews. He would speak of him with a mix of affection and frustration. He would say, "We wish Gary the best," or "Gary is doing his own thing." It was the polite language of a divorced spouse trying not to cause a scene. But behind the scenes, there was very little contact. The bridge had been burned, and neither man was willing to cross the river to rebuild it. The turn of the millennium. As the 90s bled into the 2000s, Gary Richrath became a ghost story. A whole new generation of guitar players was discovering REO Speedwagon, not through the radio but through video games like Guitar Hero and Rock Band. They would try to learn the solo to take it on the run and realize, my God, this is difficult. They would look up old videos on YouTube and see this cool, dangerous-looking guy with the sunburst Les Paul. They would ask, who is that? And where is he now? The internet sleuths found nothing. No current photos, no updates, just a void. It was as if Gary Richrath had ceased to exist in 1989. He was frozen in amber, forever young, forever rocking, forever riding the storm out. But time does not freeze for the living. In his seclusion, Gary was aging. The lifestyle choices of the past were collecting their debt. His health was beginning to fray. And there he sat for nearly 15 years, waiting. Waiting for what? An apology? A phone call? Or simply waiting for the end? It would take a literal act of God, a tornado tearing through the heartland, to finally break the silence. The first decade of the new millennium was a time of silence for the legend of Gary Richrath. While the world sped up, connected by broadband internet and smartphones, Gary remained an analog ghost in a digital machine. From the year 2000 to 2012, Gary Richrath effectively ceased to exist as a public figure. This period is the black hole of his biography. We know that the royalties from his songwriting catalog continued to flow. Gary was not starving, but he was, by all accounts, lonely. The isolation of a former rock star is a specific kind of purgatory. When you spend 20 years having your ego inflated by the roar of 80,000 people, the silence of a suburban living room can be deafening. Rumors would occasionally surface on the early internet forums. A fan would claim to have seen him at a grocery store in Los Angeles. Another would claim to have seen him at a local bar sitting alone, unrecognized. These sightings were treated like Bigfoot encounters. The truth was likely a mix of mundane reality and slow decline. The years of hard living, the alcohol, the late nights, the stress, were collecting their interest. Gary gained weight. His hair, once a lion's mane, thinned. The sharp-jawed, dangerous-looking guitar hero of 1981 was fading into a heavy-set, fragile, older man. Meanwhile, the entity of REO Speedwagon continued its relentless march. Kevin Cronin and the current lineup were road warriors, playing the state fairs and the casinos, keeping the brand alive. They were the custodians of the legacy. But every night, when they played the opening chords of Riding the Storm Out, there was a phantom on the stage. The notes were correct, but the spirit, that chaotic, dangerous Midwestern lightning, was missing. It seemed that the story would end this way. A slow fade to black. A legend forgotten by the mainstream, remembered only by the purists, passing away in obscurity without ever striking another note in anger. But fate, as it often does in Gary's life, arrived in the form of a storm. November 17, 2013. The weather in Illinois is a living thing. It is violent, unpredictable, and indifferent to human plans. Gary knew this better than anyone. He had built his career on a song about a blizzard in the Rockies. On Sunday, November 17, 2013, the sky over central Illinois turned a bruised shade of purple and green. A massive system of supercell thunderstorms exploded across the Midwest. One specific tornado, an EF4 monster with winds reaching 190 miles per hour, touched down near the city of East Peoria, Gary's hometown. It tore a path of destruction through the town of Washington, Illinois. It leveled entire neighborhoods. It stripped houses to their foundations. It tossed cars like toys. In a matter of minutes, hundreds of families lost everything. The devastation was absolute. The community where Gary had grown up, the people who had bought his first records, the high school friends, the neighbors, they were hurting. In the aftermath, the instinct of the Midwest kicked in. We help our own. REO Speedwagon, though long removed from Illinois, still considered it their spiritual home. Kevin Cronin watched the news footage with horror. He saw the flattened streets that he used to drive down. He knew he had to do something. The band organized a benefit concert. They called it Rock to the Rescue. It was scheduled for December 4th, 2013, at the U.S. Cellular Coliseum in Bloomington, Illinois. The goal was simple: raise money, raise spirits, and show the people of Central Illinois that they weren't forgotten. They called in favors. They got sticks to join the bill. They got Richard marks. It was going to be a massive night of Illinois rock and roll. But there was one name that hung in the air, unspoken but screaming to be heard. You cannot have a celebration of Illinois rock history, a benefit for the people of Peoria, without the son of Peoria. You cannot play Ridin' the Storm Out to a crowd of tornado survivors without the man who wrote it. Kevin Cronin picked up the phone. Imagine the weight of that phone call. Kevin Cronin and Gary Richrath had not shared a stage in 24 years. Their relationship had been defined by a deep brotherly love that soured into a bitter professional divorce. There were decades of silence, of lawyers, of separate lives between them. But disaster has a way of rendering old grudges irrelevant. When your hometown is in ruins, creative differences from 1989 seem incredibly petty. Kevin dialed the number. Gary answered. The conversation, by all accounts, was warm. The ice didn't just break, it shattered. Kevin explained the situation. He told Gary about the devastation. He told him about the concert. And he asked the question that every REO Speedwagon fan had been praying for since the Clinton administration. Gary, will you come home? Will you play with us one last time? Gary didn't hesitate. He didn't ask about money. He didn't ask about billing. He didn't ask for a contract. He just said yes. For Gary, this wasn't about a career comeback. He wasn't trying to sell a new album. This was about his people. This was about Peoria. It was the working class hero ethos coming back to the surface. The factory town needed him, and he was going to clock in. December 4th, 2013. The U.S. Cellular Coliseum was packed to the rafters. The atmosphere was electric but heavy. The audience was filled with people who had lost their homes. They were tired. They were grieving. They needed a release. They needed to scream. Backstage, the tension was of a different kind. Gary Richrath had arrived. To the members of the current REO Speedwagon lineup, musicians like Dave Amato and Brian Hitt, who had been in the band for years, Gary was a myth. He was the ghost they lived with every day. Now, he was flesh and blood standing in the dressing room. He looked different. The years of seclusion and health issues had taken their toll. He moved slowly. He was heavy. He wore loose clothing to hide his frame. He didn't look like the rock god of 1981. He looked like a grandfather. There was a palpable nervousness. Could he still play? It had been years since he stood on a stage of this magnitude. His hands, those precious, insured hands that had birthed the solo to take it on the run, were they still nimble? Or had the arthritis and the rust set in? Kevin Cronin later described the mood. He was worried. He wanted this to be a triumph for Gary, not an embarrassment. He wanted his old friend to feel the love, but he was terrified that the physical reality might not match the memory. Gary sat in the dressing room, holding his guitar. It wasn't the pristine 1959 burst from the old days. It was a different Les Paul. But as he warmed up playing unplugged, the familiar nervous twitch of his left hand appeared. He was ready. The concert was already a success. Styx had rocked the house. REO Speedwagon was midway through their set, playing the hits. The crowd was singing along, forgetting their troubles for a few hours. Then, the lights went down. Kevin Cronin stepped to the microphone. His voice cracked slightly with emotion. He didn't need a script for this. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kevin said, the anticipation in the room rising like a physical wave. We have a special surprise for you tonight. From East Peoria, Illinois. Please welcome back to the REO Speedwagon stage, Mr. Gary Richrath. The roar was deafening. It wasn't just a cheer, it was a primal sound. It was the sound of 8,000 people welcoming a lost family member home. Gary walked out from the shadows. He walked slowly, a bit unsteadily. He was wearing a dark jacket and sunglasses, hiding his eyes from the glare of the spotlights. He strapped on the Les Paul. He plugged in. And then he hit the switch. Da-na, da-na, da-na. The opening siren riff of Ridin' the Storm Out. The years melted away. The weight gain, the gray hair, the slow walk, none of it mattered. The sound was there. That thick, aggressive, unmistakable growl. It filled the arena. It shook the dust from the rafters. For the people of Illinois who had literally ridden a storm out just weeks before, this wasn't just a song. It was an exorcism. It was their anthem of survival. Gary stood center stage, legs planted. He didn't run around like he used to. He couldn't. But his hands knew what to do. When the solo came, he leaned back. He closed his eyes behind the sunglasses. And he let it rip. Was it technically perfect? Perhaps not. There might have been a missed note here or there, but the feel, that ferocious quiver, that screaming sustain, was 100% pure Richrath. It was the sound of a man pouring 20 years of silence into 3 minutes of noise. Kevin Cronin looked over at him, beaming. The two men who had fought so bitterly over the soul of this band were sharing the microphone again, leaning in, shoulder to shoulder. At the end of the song, the ovation went on for minutes. Gary raised his hand, a shy smile breaking across his face. He looked overwhelmed. He looked happy. Kevin hugged him. It was a genuine embrace. It was a closing of the circle. Gary played only one song. That was all he had the stamina for. He unplugged, waved to the crowd, and walked back into the shadows. It was the last time he would ever perform in public. In the days following the Rock to the Rescue concert, the internet exploded. Videos of the performance, shaky and shot on cell phones, went viral among the fan base. The comments were filled with tears. He's back. Please let this be a reunion tour. REO isn't REO without Gary. There was a surge of hope. But behind the scenes, the reality was starker. The reunion had been a triumph of will, but it had also exposed the fragility of Gary's health. He was not well. The stamina required to tour, the travel, the 2-hour shows, the grind, was simply beyond him. Kevin Cronin knew it, the band knew it, and deep down, Gary probably knew it too. There would be no reunion tour. There would be no comeback album. The night in Bloomington was not a new beginning. It was a goodbye. It was a swan song, a final burst of beauty before the end. Gary returned to California, but he returned with something he hadn't had in years: validation. He knew that he was loved. He knew that he hadn't been forgotten. He knew that when he stepped on stage, the magic was still there. He had made peace with his legacy, and he had made peace with his brother, Kevin. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the cold silence of estrangement. It was the warm silence of completion. The year 2014 passed quietly. Gary remained in seclusion. But in 2015, the health issues that had been shadowing him began to close in. The specific details of his medical history are private, guarded by his family. But we know the end was precipitated by a severe stomach ailment. Years of hard living, the alcohol, the stress, the lack of self-care can wreak havoc on the digestive system. Gary was hospitalized. It wasn't supposed to be the end. It was a surgery, a procedure. There was hope for recovery, but the body is a fragile machine. Complications arose. The strength that had allowed him to survive the music business, the critics, and the isolation began to fail him physically. He was 65 years old. In the grand scheme of life, that is too young. B.B. King played into his 80s. Les Paul played into his 90s. Gary should have had his blues elder statesman era. He should have been sitting on a stool in a jazz club playing slow, soulful licks for respectful audiences. But fate is rarely fair to rock stars. September 13th, 2015. The news traveled the way modern bad news travels. A text message, a tweet, a Facebook post. Gary Richrath has passed away. It didn't seem real. To the fans, he was invincible. He was the guy who rode the storm out. He was the golden god with the sunburst guitar. Kevin Cronin was the one to confirm it to the world. He posted a photo on the band's official page. It was an old photo from the 70s. Gary and Kevin, young, sweating, locked in the groove, hair flying. The caption read, "I feel so sad." Gary was both a unique guitarist and a powerful songwriter. He embodied the tough guy exterior, but had a heart of gold. I learned most of what I know about being in a rock band from Gary Richrath. The entire REO family mourns his death and shares in the grief of his family, friends, and fans. The shockwave went through the rock community. It wasn't just the fans. It was the other musicians. Slash from Guns N' Roses, Tom Morello, country stars like Keith Urban. They all came out to pay tribute. They spoke of his tone. They spoke of his vibrato. They spoke of how, when they were kids in their bedrooms, they tried to learn the solo to Take It on the Run and couldn't quite get it right because Gary's feel was impossible to replicate. The radio stations changed their playlists. For a week, the airways were dominated by the sound of Gary's Les Paul. DJs told stories of seeing REO in the 70s, of Gary stealing the show. In death, the silence was finally broken. The music was louder than ever. When a giant tree falls in the forest, the crash is deafening, but it is the silence that follows which is truly profound. The birds stop singing. The wind seems to hold its breath. The landscape is irrevocably altered. There is a hole in the canopy where the sun used to be blocked, a gap in the skyline that feels unnatural. The morning after September 13th, 2015, the world of classic rock woke up to that specific kind of silence. Gary Richrath was gone. For the casual observer, it was a sad headline on a news crawler. REO Speedwagon guitarist dies at 65. A moment of nostalgia, a brief thought of, "Oh, I loved that song," and then life moved on. But for the musicians, the historians, and the true believers, the loss was tectonic. It wasn't just that a man had died, it was that a sound had died. In the days following his passing, the tributes began to paint a picture of just what had been lost. It wasn't the polite praise given to a retired celebrity. It was the reverence shown to a master craftsman. Dave Amato, the man who had the impossible job of filling Gary's shoes in REO Speedwagon since 1989, spoke with a profound humility. He acknowledged what every guitarist knew. I can play the notes, I can play the solos, note for note, but I can never sound like Gary. This is the crux of the Gary Richrath legacy. In an era of copy-paste pop stars and digital modeling amps that can replicate any sound with a microchip, Gary was uncopyable. He was a fingerprint in audio form. As the funeral arrangements were made, private, dignified, family-centric, a different kind of memorial was taking place on the airwaves and the internet. It was a forensic examination of his genius. People weren't just mourning the man. They were mourning the extinction of a species, the Midwestern guitar hero. To understand the true weight of Gary Richrath's contribution, we need to dissect the mechanics of his sound. It wasn't about complex effects or studio magic. It was a 1959 Gibson Les Paul plugged directly into a 100-watt Marshall amp. turned all the way up. That was it. No pedals, no tricks, just wood, wire, and a massive amount of electricity. This reckless approach created a sound that was thick, aggressive, and possessed an endless sustain that modern technology still struggles to replicate. This raw simplicity is exactly why critics often overlooked him. During the height of REO Speedwagon's fame, music critics dismissed them as corporate rock. They missed the point. Gary wasn't trying to be an art school experimentalist like Eddie Van Halen. He was a bluesman playing at arena volume. He played for the working class crowd, delivering a sound that was accessible, heavy, and real. Gary passed away too young, but the work remains bulletproof. 50 years later, you still hear his riffs on the radio every day. He might not have the critical prestige of a Jimmy Page, but among actual guitarists, he is respected as a master of tone. He didn't change the history of music, but he defined the sound of the American Midwest. So forget the tragic final years. Remember the prime. 1981. Stage right. A leather jacket and a sunburst guitar. He looks at the crowd, smiles, and hits a chord that shakes the floorboards. It was loud. It was dangerous. And it was real.